So, who invented the word balloon? Who was the first cartoonist millionaire? Where did the term comic book come from? Join us now as we talk with award winning fine artist and cartoonist Robert Brunelle Jr. about the history of cartooning. And this is episode 4 of Storycomic Presents. And I have with me an amazing guy. He uh, he has a long history with all types of art. You did fine art, you did painting, sculpture. You were an art teacher for how many years?
35.
35 years. And so there
Gray hair.
So needless to say, it's no understatement to say that he has taught and inspired multiple generations of artists that are all around the area. And so I was able to meet Robert Brunelle Jr. Mr. Brunelle Explains It All a few years ago through our group, through the Vermont Comic Creators. I was able, and we did an art show. We shared an art show together with the Vermont Comic Creators 2 years ago, I believe, here in Morrisville at the River Arts. And Robert was there to for the gallery opening, the show opening. I sat there with him and Robert. Someone asked you a question about cartooning. The entire room was hushed as Robert began to just
monopolize the conversation. Yes,
I wouldn't even say, but just you just saw the passion in your eyes where you all of a sudden you just started talking about just the history of cartooning and how it started and names that the historians still remember, and how impactful cartooning actually has and where we are in modern society. That is the closest I can really get to an introduction. So people who are listening or watching this, what got you first into it? To take us back a bit, before the 35 years of being an art teacher, talk to us about what became your passion. It was like everybody has a story to tell. What became your passion? Of why did you decide these specific mediums of art to be able to tell your story, and what drew you into the cartooning and fine arts in general?
Not only for myself, but when I was an art teacher, I realized cartooning is often the first introduction that kids have to art. And I used cartooning as a teacher to introduce just about every concept, perspective, color, composition. You can do it all through cartooning. And myself, I loved the Sunday funnies. I wasn't terribly interested in comic books at that time, but I loved the Sunday funnies. And in those days, they were an inch thick. We used to get the New York Daily News Sunday funnies, and this would have been the early 60s, and this was the very end of the first generation of great cartoonists, like Bringing Up Father and all those cartoon strips. Those artists were just dying off. That generation was dying off around that time. But Chester Gould and Dick Tracy and Dondi and so on. And there was also, just at the time they were making the transition to the modern comics like Wizard of Id and Broomhilda and all that sort of thing. So I spent lots of time just imitating those cartoonists and learning to draw by sitting on my desk and drawing like they drew, like Al Capps, the Labner, for instance. I learned a lot about ink technique by copying him faithfully, and so on and so forth.
So that's how you got into. That's how you first started getting into art. Basically, is just we hear this a lot for any people started. They get into it young, and they start doing it, as you say, by copying what their famous styles were.
Yeah.
Did you, while you started doing that, have you, as you've grown, and we'll talk a little bit later about your cartoons, was there somebody that you just latched right onto? Like, I know for me, it was Jim Davis when I was a kid drawing Garfield. So a lot of my circles seem to mimic eyes. Who was the cartoonist that you grabbed right a hold of?
I first cartoons that I drew were the so-called Bigfoot style cartoons. The characters had big bulbous noses and three-fingered hands and big feet. And so I was copying people like fellow who did Broomhilda, I forgot the name of. Moose Miller was another one that was popular. Super Duper was another one. Those types of Bigfoot cartoons, very loose style, very easy to do for a kid. You know, I wasn't going to be copying Terry and the Pirates or anything like that, because that stuff was way too sophisticated for a kid. But anybody could draw Erwin the Troll from Broomhilda, because he was just a big nose, a lot of hair, some feet. And so, as I said, I was never interested in the superhero genre. I was interested in making people laugh. So from the get-go, my cartoons were always about jokes. And I was heavily influenced by Mad Magazine, Don Martin, and those guys. Again, the simpler styles, Shigeru Aragones, and Spy versus Spy, and all that sort of thing.
Sure.
That was the kind of stuff I loved.
Well, and I know when we sat down, when you were talking about it, you almost to the, I would say there was a playful disdain in your voice when you mentioned the capes, like you said, like, and so I mean, a lot of our colleagues who draw superhero comics, you never went that direction, now, did you?
Never did. I was first. I started out with the Sunday Funnies, that the comic strips I enjoyed. Then, as I went into high school, I became very fond of the underground cartoonists. This would have been the early 70s, just past the peak. But I first discovered Robert Crumb when I stood transfixed in a Woolworths one day looking at his famous album cover for Janis Joplin's album. And I just, oh my God, this is fantastic. So I was too young to read the undergrounds unless I snuck into the bookstore when nobody was looking. And there was a bookstore in my hometown that carried them, and I used to sneak a peek. But I loved Mad Magazine, and I loved later on National Lampoon. It came out in '72. I read all the National Lampoons. And a lot of the underground cartoonists found a home in National Lampoon. People like Bobby London and Sherry Flanagan and those people, Charlie Rodriguez, and those were my heroes. So as I said, yeah, for me, cartoons were always about humor, making people laugh and making a point, and being kind of edgy, cutting edge, and that sort of thing. I wasn't interested in storytelling as so much as gags. Then I discovered older cartoonists. As I got older, I went back in time and I discovered Virgil Partch and Roland Emmett and Goliath Williams and the old New Yorker cartoonists from the 20s and 30s, Charles Adams and those people. And I just became fascinated. I started collecting books of those cartoonists.
And so you mentioned some of those. So with that said, do you really define, a part of it is, does style dictate story? Meaning, do you see some of the cartoons that you followed? Does that style really necessitate it has to be humorous, or do you see, when we talk about the difference between the capes and the humorous ones, do you see somebody who can draw like that seem to lean more towards those superhero comics as compared to drawing more humorous stuff? Have you seen in your history, have you ever seen people kind of mix mediums or mix styles a bit?
There have been. Frank Cho, for instance, drew Liberty Meadows. He drew it in a very straightforward Littlefoot style, but it was always about gags. Bloom County was kind of like that, drawn in a sort of Littlefoot style, but it was humor. So yeah, some cartoonists have mixed the two. The Littlefoot style, where everything's anatomically correct, usually lends itself to the superhero genre or horror comics. I love the war and horror comics of the 70s, by the eerie and creepy and those. Whereas the Bigfoot style, well, I won't say no one can tell a serious story with that, but it's difficult.
Right.
And some mix the two, like Bone. I forgot who the artist is, but he mixes cartoony characters with realistic looking characters in the same story.
Right. Yeah. Jeff Smith. Yeah.
Yeah. So it can be done.
So that's interesting. This is the first time I ever heard the term Bigfoot and Littlefoot. Is that
That's an old cartoonist in the biz. We generally sort cartoons into two groups: the Littlefoot style and the Bigfoot style.
Okay.
Peanuts is Bigfoot. Garfield is Bigfoot.
Right.
Because they have big feet and usually have three-fingered hands, and nothing is anatomically correct.
Right.
Foxtrot, example.
So you would see that it's easier to take a Littlefoot style into a humorous section than the other way around.
Probably, I would say, yeah. Yeah, because you can do it ironically. In fact, Marvel did it. They did Not Brand Eck, in which they used very straight-looking Littlefoot style of their own characters, but they did it for laughs.
Right.
And Mad Magazine could do that. Of course, they could imitate anything. So their artists could take any style and play it for laughs.
Yeah, especially their satire section when they kind of do the. So in a way, like a caricature of where they do that would be almost kind of an in-between of Bigfoot and Littlefoot?
Well, yeah. As I said, like Mad started in the 1950s being strictly a parody of comic books.
Right.
They didn't get into the movies and all that other stuff till later. So Wally Wood and all those early Mad artists, their specialty was copying comic strips and comic book artists, and very realistic, very accurately, but doing it for humor.
So take us back a bit. Take us back to where
there's been a lot of. Well, if you show the woodcut of the monk's head bagpipe, can you show that? There it is. Yeah. A lot of people argue about what was the very first true cartoon, but I usually point to this thing and things like it. This is from 1530. It's a wood block, and it shows the devil playing a monk's head as a bagpipe. And it was an anti-Catholic diatribe during the Protestant Reformation when Martin Luther was doing his thing. But these were printed very cheaply, and they were pasted on the sides of buildings and so on and so forth. And the little words down in the corner, that space was left blank. And so that was added afterwards. So whoever printed the poster could put that down in the corner, and that would change from one poster to another. So actually, this same image was used by anti-Protestants, in which they said that's Martin Luther's head, and so they put a different doggerel down in the corner.
Okay.
I've seen this used both as anti-Catholic and anti-Protestant, but this is the sort of thing we're thinking about. The word cartoon derives from the word carton, which is an Italian word from the 16th century. And it's the same root that we get the word carton or cardstock, as it referred to a heavy paper. And if you put up the picture of Raphael's,
okay.
Oh yeah, you got that, yeah.
Yeah.
So originally, a cartoon was a preparatory drawing that a painter would make before making the painting. And if you show me the picture of Raphael that I sent you there.
All right.
There it is. So this is a cartoon that Raphael drew for one of his paintings, and it's on heavy paper.
Right.
And what they would do if they were going to make frescoes, then they would take a needle and make little holes all along the lines, and then they'd pounce it with powdered charcoal to transfer it to the wall. So like that's how Michelangelo did it.
So what we're looking at here, Robert, it's the sketch of which painting is it? I recognize
the School of Athens by Raphael.
School of Athens. So it's basically, it looks like a charcoal drawing.
It's a giant charcoal drawing. Life size. He would draw these as big as the actual painting would be.
Oh, it's like a 1-to-1, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
So he needed that really heavy paper.
Mm-hmm.
So if you read old art history books from the 19th century, you'll still see the word cartoon used that way. There was a cartoon by Raphael of the School of Athens.
Okay.
But then, if you show the Punch, this is the cover of the very first Punch magazine.
Okay.
In 1841, a group of humorists in London got together and created the magazine Punch. And it was based on an Italian magazine called Charivari. So they called it the London Charivari. And as a joke, they hired humorous artists like Tennille, who drew the first drawings for Alice in Wonderland,
okay,
to draw humorous drawings. But as a joke, they called them cartoons thinking, because cartoon's really a serious drawing. So we're calling these humorous drawings cartoons, ironically. But what happened was the original meaning of the word cartoon faded from the public mind, and instead everybody assumed that Punch's definition of the word cartoon was the real definition. So
okay.
So it started out as a joke, but it became real. So now when we say cartoon, we're talking about humorous drawings.
So was Punch basically like the 19th century version of Mad Magazine then?
Yes.
In a way?
Okay. In a way, yes. It was a combination of humorous prose, essays, poems, and humorous drawings.
Okay.
Now, the early Punch cartoons, the speech balloon hadn't been invented yet, so they would have just the caption underneath. I'm trying to think. I don't have an example of a Punch cartoon handy, but yeah, they were mostly single-panel gag cartoons, what we'd call a single-panel gag cartoon with the line underneath.
Okay.
When Punch came along, that we started using the word cartoon the way we do now.
So basically, what the term we use, as you say, the term we use as the word cartoon started with the Punch, the Punch magazines, and Punch was basically like the Mad Magazine of the 1840s.
Yep.
It was a collection. It was a magazine that was satirical, and that was based off of a satirical Italian magazine.
Cavalieri. I'm not pronouncing it correctly.
Right. At what point when this Punch came out, what else was out there than 1840s? Was this a point where a lot of people, how accessible was like drawings and satirical illustrations of this manner?
Well, newspapers were just coming into the fore. Newspapers had been around since the 1700s, but they're really starting to be mass produced around this time.
Okay.
And there were also monthly periodicals. This is an 1870 issue of Harper's Weekly right here.
Okay. And Harper's Weekly, was that the
American?
That was an American.
It was an American thing. So it would be sort of like a newspaper. It'd have ads in the back. But the reason I own this is right here is the very first Thomas Nast Democratic Donkey.
Okay, that's
right
cool.
There. And so yeah, there were periodicals and journals and magazines and things like that. By the way, why do we call magazines magazines? Have you ever wondered that? A magazine is really a container, like the magazine of a gun.
Right.
It's an Arabic word, and it simply meant a place where you put stuff. So a magazine in paper was a collection of clippings. The editors would clip news stories and things from other periodicals and put them together in this container, the magazine.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah. It's the same root as like the magazine of a gun.
Right.
You keep your bullets. Yeah.
So 1840 is when we start hearing the word cartoon. Mm-hmm. And that, how quickly did that kind of catch on if they're just using it as a satirical term? Because you said cartoon originally meant a sketch of something that's going to be more
serious. Yeah.
More serious.
Well, I think once Punch became very popular, I think the general public, who didn't know much about real art history anyways, mm-hmm. So for them, Punch's definition of the word cartoon was it. They probably didn't know about the other definition. Only art historians and art collectors knew the real word cartoon. So for them, yeah, cartoon, funny drawing. Yeah, I get it. So by the 1890s, newspapers, especially the big chains like Hearst and Pulitzer, who were the two rival chains, every Sunday they would have a color supplement called The Funny Pages or The Comic Pages. And by the late 19th century, artists began to put cartoons in these comic pages. And here's a very famous one. This is the Yellow Kid in Hogan's Alley. And it was about a bunch of immigrant kids living in the poor section of the big city, aping their betters. And so here they are riding on a trolley. So the reason we call comics is because of this. Because originally these strips appeared in the comic pages. And that's also the funny. They're also called the funny pages.
Okay.
See you in the funny pages, like they used to say in the 30s. So the original funny pages didn't have cartoons in there. They were just poems and puzzles and games and things. But Hearst and Pulitzer and the others began to realize that the late 19th century saw an influx of European immigrants who couldn't speak English, but the comics were a tremendous way of making them attractive to the papers, to sell the papers, because you really didn't need to read English very well to get the joke. It's the same reason that silent movies were so popular and vaudeville. There's a direct link between vaudeville, silent movies, and early newspaper comics. They all grew up around the same time, and they all were popular for the same reason, because you didn't need to speak English to understand them. The immigrants loved these things, and if you put up the Katzenjammer Kids, 1897, the Katzenjammer is German. It roughly translates to cats screaming. But yeah, Rudolf Dirks created the Katzenjammer Kids in 1897, and it was the longest running comic strip in history. In fact, it was still around when I started reading cartoons in the 60s. It was about Hans and Fritz, a pair of mischievous German immigrants, and it had a huge appeal to the immigrant population. But this is the sort of humor that was also popular in vaudeville. And there's a link between vaudeville and early comic strips. For instance, Segar, who drew Thimble Theater, where we see Popeye for the first time, he called it Thimble Theater. And in the beginning, he actually drew it as if you were on stage. You'd have all the characters come out on stage and introduce themselves.
Oh, okay.
And a lot of the takes, for instance, you've seen that trope of the character being astonished and they flip over backwards and with a puff of smoke.
Right.
That came from vaudeville. The idea of characters wearing white gloves, that came from vaudeville. It came from the minstrel shows, actually.
Okay.
So there was a direct link. In fact, Milt Gross and Rube Goldberg and those guys, they said, we're vaudevillians, really. Those cartoon strips were vaudeville on paper. And same with silent movies. In fact, Charlie Chaplin had a comic strip in the 20s when he was really popular.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and so there's a big crossover between movies, silent movies, and comic strips, and so on and so forth.
So it went from the word cartoon, kind of, as you said, it grew, and then you said it grew, and then with Harper's Weekly, you saw that over those several years of it growing, and then the term comic came out when it was actually those illustrations, those cartoons were posted in the funny parts of and that's when they start having these visuals.
Right.
And okay. And as you say, as we said, that humor is universal. When you take the words out and just have the pictures on, it just exploded in popularity then in like the early 20th century.
Oh yeah, that was the heyday. In fact, Rudolf Dirks, who we just talked about, he invented a lot of the visual language of daily strips. For instance, he invented the speech balloon, as we know it today.
The word bubble, you mean?
Yeah, the word bubbles. Prior to that, the captions were always below the drawing, but he came up with the idea. He probably didn't invent. I'm sure somebody in the past. I know hardline cartoonists are. No, he didn't. But for our intents and purposes, Dirks pretty much popularized. Let's not say invented. He popularized the idea of the speech balloon, and he invented a lot of the visual language of how he places the characters in the frame and so on and so forth.
Okay.
So he was a great pioneer. Another pioneer would be Buster Brown. But the reason I bring up Buster Brown is because we're also at this time, this would be 1902, we're starting to see the link between comics and advertising.
Okay.
We still remember Buster Brown shoes. I think they're still around today. Outcult was one of the first pioneers to realize that there's money to be made by licensing your characters to sell products.
Wow.
This
is the first time we started seeing like the intellectual property then.
Right. Well, it's interesting that in those days, comic artists did not own their characters. The characters were owned by the publisher.
Okay.
So, for instance, Dirks was lured away from one syndicate to another, but he couldn't take the Katzenjammer Kids with him. So they hired a different artist to do the Castor Jammer Kids, and then he started a rival strip called The Captain and the Kids, using exactly the same characters. So for many years, the two strips ran as rivals to one another. Artists didn't really start to control their own work until the mid 20th century.
Well, you see that also in like with when we're talking about like the world of the capes there with your little feet. Marvel and DC own those rights to all those superheroes.
Now, if we go to My Little Nemo, Winsor McCay, 1905, from a purely artistic point of view, the newspaper comic strip reached its zenith with Little Nemo in Slumberland by Winsor McCay. And one of the reasons it was so gorgeous is because of the printing process. It was done with a lithographic process as opposed to the Ben-Day dots that they used later, which were cheaper. So these pages, and newspapers themselves were physically bigger. And so he would do these gorgeous, full-color, Art Nouveau influenced drawings. And they were considered, Little Nemo in Slumberland is considered the greatest early 20th century comic strip ever created. And for those who aren't familiar, Little Nemo is a 5-year-old boy who falls asleep every night and has these wonderful adventures in Slumberland. Then the last panel, he wakes up, falls out of bed, and he realizes it's all a dream. But if we move on to Gertie the Dinosaur, Winsor McCay was one of the pioneers of animation. And you can find it, it's still on YouTube, the original Gertie the Dinosaur. I used to show it to my students.
Okay.
This is one of the first animated cartoons. He made hundreds of thousands of drawings by hand in ink, and he projected it on the screen, and he himself would come out on stage and interact with Gertie on the screen, pretend to give Gertie an apple and so forth. And it became a huge sensation because no one had ever seen something like this before.
Wow. This would probably be the 21st century equivalent of what we're doing with like virtual reality now, putting on virtual reality.
Up to now, all the strips we've been talking about were Sunday funnies. But Bud Fisher started what would become the first daily strip, the daily 4-panel strip, which was always black and white. And this is Mutt and Jeff, and this Bud Fisher on the left looking at him. And what's interesting about Bud Fisher is he's the very first cartoonist to become a millionaire. And because he understood the importance of licensing, so he licensed Mutt and Jeff for everything. And he made a tremendous amount of money. The New Yorker, of course, plays a very important role in the history of cartooning because they still are one of the few venues that pays very good money for cartoons. Mm-hmm. So a lot of tremendous cartoonists got their start there, including Peter Arno, for instance, and Charles Addams, inventor of the Addams Family, started the New Yorker. James Thurber was in the New Yorker.
Right. Yeah.
And it still is home to some of the world's greatest cartoonists. So in the early days, every magazine had single panel gag cartoons, but today very few still do. New Yorker is probably one of the few that still bothers to have single panel cartoons anymore.
So let's just take a step back for a second and say, so we had Rudolph Dirks was a founding father of cartooning because he kind of popularized the word balloon. Mm-hmm. And then you say like Winsor McCay is one of the founding fathers because he was the first one to really kind of start doing like long form comics. He just pushed the art form of cartooning to its apex. Right. Okay.
He just drew the most gorgeous cartoons ever, in my opinion.
And then Bud Fisher is the one who basically made it a pretty successful career.
Yeah, he did. He made a lot of money. As I said, he launched the first daily strip.
Right. And how did this relate to, because this is kind of parallel, and I know this might not be more in your wheelhouse, but I'm curious of how much you know about, say, like children's book illustrations. This is kind of, there's a parallel path. It seems as though as comic strips became more popular, you actually started having pretty exquisite looking children's book illustrations as well.
Yes, there was a big crossover, actually. Going back to Punch, I talked about Tenniel, or Tenniel. I never knew how to pronounce his name properly. But he, in addition to being a Punch cartoonist, he drew illustration for the very first edition of Alice in Wonderland.
Yep.
Dr. Seuss, for instance.
Okay.
Before he was a well-known children's book author, he was a cartoonist. He drew political cartoons in the 40s.
Okay.
And he had a very short-lived daily strip in the 40s as well. And then he really hit the big time when he drew Cat in the Hat in the 50s.
Right.
So yes, you're right. There is a crossover between.
So we're right now where we are in the kind of the history of what we're talking about with cartooning. We are about the 1915, 1920s.
Which brings me to my next illustration. This is the world's very first comic book.
Aha, okay.
It was published by Max Gaines in 1933. And what he did was, as the name implies, he cut out daily strips and pasted them in order and published it in book form.
So he made a magazine then, right?
He did. He made a magazine of daily comic strips.
Okay.
But the difference was all these characters were already famous in newsprint. None of these characters were invented for comic books.
Okay.
Now, his son, William F. Gaines, continued the tradition. Max created EC Comics, and they, under William's guidance, they were famous for their horror comics in the 50s.
Right.
Like, what was it? The Crypt, Tales from the Crypt, and so forth. But then Frederick Wertham, the famous psychologist in the 50s, I think it was 54, wrote his book, Seduction of the Innocent, and kind of put the kibosh to those gory comics. So William F. Gaines was out of work. He needed something to do, so Harvey Kurtzman pitched him the idea of, let's do a satire magazine, and thus Mad Magazine was born. So William F. Gaines was the publisher of Mad Magazine.
Was there any licensing challenges when he made this magazine, the Famous Funnies, with all these different artists and comics?
I'm sure he worked out a deal with the syndicates, because remember, in those days, the artists didn't own
right
the cartoons, the syndicates did.
Right.
So I'm sure he worked out some kind of distribution deal with the syndicates to do that. So now I'll go to my final slide, Superman, 1938. Superman was one of the first, if not the first, and I'm not exactly sure if he was the first, but he was one of the first characters designed for comic books.
Okay.
There was Superman comic strips for a while, but he was the first character to be invented solely for comic books.
Okay.
And so he launched the whole cape sling that has grown to dominate the market.
And so that basically is, Superman really Action Comics. So June 1938, pre-World War II, really defined, because I know there's a really cool and I'll probably put a link in the show notes about this, but there's some pretty interesting public domain websites where people can actually go and look at some Ajax Farrell and some of the other one, Harvey Comics. There's a lot of them from like the 1930s and 40s, and then when the 40s hit, you saw a lot of World War II propaganda stuff. That's where you started seeing.
Oh yes, World War II was a boom to the comic book industry for a couple of reasons. One, because they were very useful to make propaganda.
Right.
But also the GIs loved them.
Right.
Because they were lightweight, they could pack them around, they could take them out and read them while they're resting, in between battles or whatever, and they were cheap. And so when the GIs came home, that they continued their habit of reading comic books. Prior to that, comic books were just funny things for kiddies, but more, of course, the GI, a lot of them were just teenagers.
Right.
So the comic book became more popular with older readers thanks to World War II, basically. Right. And there was also, starting in the 1940s, the teenager comic, Archie.
Yeah.
By Bob Montana. I think it was 45 or early 40s.
Well, yeah, because Archie Comics actually had a lot of comic books, had a lot of series to it, but for some reason they just grabbed a hold of Archie.
Genre is one of the most successful franchises ever launched, actually.
Right.
I think there are more Archie titles than there are superhero titles.
So what happened? So basically, the 50s, the Comics Code. Why did these horror comics and these war comics and these teenage comics, all these other ones? Why did it? What happened that made that flip to where it seemed only the superhero comics seemed to have survived that Comics Code?
Well, Frederick Wertham and his seduction of the innocent is what happened.
Okay.
It's around this time, the 40s and early 50s, that we first hear the phrase juvenile delinquent.
Okay.
And because people don't realize, let's do a little social history here. Prior to 1930, there was no such thing as a teenager. Throughout most of history, you were either a child or an adult. There was nothing in between.
Okay.
Unless you were rich, you didn't go to high school. You quit school in the 6th grade and then you went to work on the farm or in the factory. But after the Depression, so many people were thrown out of work that when employers started hiring people, they only hired married men, because their idea was the married man could support the family.
Right.
So now, for the first time, high school becomes mandatory. So they invent this creature called the teenager by artificially extending childhood to make room for all this education. And so it's around this time that we get Rebel Without a Cause, biker gangs, juvenile delinquency, jazz records, and all this sort of thing. And then, of course, rock and roll. And so the older generation became alarmed about this new generation of children who have money. For the first time after the war, you have a huge generation of people who have discretionary income. And so fashion designers and musicians and comic book people began to realize we can cater to this gigantic untapped market and make a fortune. So that's when you start seeing teenage related stuff like the beach movies and so on and so forth, geared to this generation who had money. But there were people who were alarmed about this because it was an open field. I mean, anything goes. If you read those old horror comics from the 50s, they're gruesome, even by today's standards. The one that that Wertham particularly hated was the ice pick to the eye motif. Or there's one where a guy's we see a close-up of a guy holding an axe in his wife's head. You know, these things were brutal. And even artists like Jack Davis. Oh, the one that really went over the top was Jack Davis did one about a baseball game in which human organs were used as the bases because they take a guy apart. And his liver was third base. So needless to say, Wertham wasn't buying any of that. Plus, Wertham was very upset about the relationship between Batman and Robin, which he felt was a homosexual fantasy. And so he felt it was a corrupting influence on the youth. So he almost put Gaines out of business, and he put a lot of the other people out of business. So a lot of those titles, like you couldn't have bloody war comics with people's heads getting blown off or anything anymore.
Right.
All this stuff went by the wayside. And comic books almost died. But they came back to life in the 60s thanks to people like Stan Lee. Mm-hmm. Because he understood that what the comic books really were about was about the misunderstood teenager who feels that nobody understands me and everybody hates me, but I have these superpowers and I'll show them. So he tapped into that vast wellspring of self-pity that teenagers have, and he built his whole empire on it.
Okay. Prior
to him, superheroes didn't have problems. Superman was just this well-adjusted guy who went around punching gangsters. But afterwards, it became about teenage angst.
Right. So that's, it's the more you're talking about this, and I realize is that
making sense now.
Well, teenagers have never changed. Like people are these days, it's TikTok and all these other things, but teenagers have always been teenagers.
Every teenager feels like the misfit outsider.
Right.
Nobody understands me. I have these secret powers, and if they just knew what I could do, I could swing from webs or whatever, then I'll show them. That was the dynamic, and it made Marvel and DC a fortune.
Right. So we got about 10 minutes left. So this one pretty quick, but I want to take some time off to talk about a little bit about what you do. And one of you're a teacher for 35 years, and now you're happily retired. And one of your one of your passions is what you're doing now is also political cartoons. Can you talk a little bit about the history of political cartoons?
I'm glad you asked. I suppose political cartoons are actually the oldest genre of cartooning.
Okay.
Going back to that monk I showed you.
Mm-hmm.
Another early example would be the famous Paul Revere engraving of the Boston Massacre.
Right.
That's a political cartoon.
Okay, sure, yeah.
And there are many, many examples of there are political cartoons about Andrew Jackson and Abraham Lincoln and so forth. So political cartooning has been around for a long, long time. And the greatest one of the great ones that America ever produced was, of course, Thomas Nast. Nast invented a lot of the visual language that political cartoons use today.
Okay.
Not only the donkey and the elephant, he also invented our modern idea of what Uncle Sam looks like.
Okay.
Wow. Guy with the top hat. He also invented our modern idea of what Santa Claus looks like.
Okay.
Because during the Civil War, he did a whole series of drawings for Harper's Weekly of the jolly elf, the fat guy with the beard and the toys under his arm. That's Thomas Nast.
Okay.
He also invented the money bags with the dollar sign.
Oh, the bag with the dollar sign.
Yeah,
okay.
That was him. And he's probably most famous for bringing down Boss Tweed, the famous corrupt politician of New York City's Tammany Hall in the 1860s. And there's a funny story. Tweed said, "I don't care what the newspapers write about me because my constituents can't read. But those pictures are going to get me." And he was right. He escaped to South America when he became indicted, but he was identified by one of Nast's cartoons. They recognized him and they arrested him and extradited him back to America. Political cartooning is a whole nother genre different than all others. On the one hand, I will never run out of material, but there's a downside to that because unlike other forms of cartooning, political cartoons have a very short shelf life. So once the event is no longer in the news, the cartoon's useless.
Right.
I've got 23 years worth of cartoons that I can never use again because, but because I was a history major in college, the reason I chose political cartooning is because I'm recording history, really. And history books will often show political cartoons to illustrate a point because it's a window into what was going on, what was on people's minds in those days.
Right.
So I launched my strip in 1997. How it got started was...
and your strip, Mr. Brunelle Explains It All.
Mr. Brunelle Explains It All.
Yeah.
The Burlington Free Press had an amateur contest for amateur cartoonists, and I won it. And I said, maybe I can make some money doing this. So the strip originally appeared in the old Vermont Times newspaper, which is defunct now. And then it was picked up by Funny Times, which is a national humor magazine. And then it was picked up by 7 Days a few years ago, and Humor Times. And it's appeared in other publications, which are now defunct, unfortunately. Unfortunately, it's a very difficult time to be a cartoonist because the traditional venues are dying. Newspapers are dying. Magazines don't carry gag cartoons anymore. So, you know, you have to go digital, but it's hard to monetize digitally.
Right.
So I also do book illustrations like this one I did for Joseph Citro, the Vermont Ghost Experience. And I'm working on a new book by Joe, which will come out hopefully by Halloween, called the Vermont Ghost Guide.
Okay.
I'm doing that.
And you also do a lot of, as you say, so you do a lot of illustrations now. You do a lot of, I was really surprised when I first met you is through your comic strip. But then when I saw your paintings, I was surprised to see that your actual cartooning style does not match at all with your painting style. Your painting is...
They're completely separate universes.
Right, yeah.
And plus, I am a sculptor, too. This is my show at River Arts. It's up right now, so go by and check it out.
Yeah, and your sculptures, as I say, kind of reminds me of like
a whole other world.
A whole nother world. It's like Rube Goldberg meets...
Yes, Rube Goldberg. Now, there's an interesting one. Yeah, I can show you some examples of what my paintings are like. This is my Fairground series, for instance.
Right. And and for our viewers who are watching this, and also for the people who are listening to it, in the show notes there's links to Robert's website that has all of his information on there of all of his books. And I also put on there as well is a link to his Humor Times section where all of his political cartoons are as well. So
it is interesting though. Every once in a while, if you follow me on Facebook, I will resurrect a cartoon I did 3 and 4 years ago because some things never change. And I've often been told that I can predict the future. For instance, I drew a cartoon in 2011 in which I predicted Trump would be president.
Uh-huh.
And so, he said, how do you do that, Mr. Bernard? I said, it's easy. You just assume the worst. You just say whatever the worst possible outcome is, that's what's going to happen. 9 times out of 10, you're right. The formula for my cartoons is if present trends continue.
Yeah.
Now, we take this thing that's happening and we carry it to its logical, absurd conclusion, what would be the outcome? And sometimes it actually happens. So what I do, every night I watch the news, then I go to my studio and I make notes and I churn out a cartoon. And then every Sunday night, I decide which of these cartoons is still going to be relevant when the paper comes out next Wednesday. Usually I get it right. So I mail it, and like I knew the coronavirus would still be a hot topic this week, so I did one about the coronavirus. The one I'm going to be doing for next week is about Biden versus Bernie.
Yep.
And I did that before everybody else dropped out, but I had a feeling they were going to drop out, and I was right.
Yep.
So that's the downside of being a political cartoonist is you're obligated to watch the news and pay attention to current events, which makes you a nervous wreck. You can't hide your head in the sand like most people do.
Yes, I mean that, and as you said, that's you because you're doing it as a weekly strip. You kind of have to guess what's going to be relevant.
Yeah, the daily guys, they got it made because they can churn them out based on what's happening that day, you know.
Right.
But with a lag time of a week, it's difficult.
Right.
But usually I got the only time I really flubbed it was when I did one about Scaramucci, or what was his name?
Oh, right.
And I did one about all his profanity, and then I sent it to the editor, and the next day Trump fires him. So I get in touch with the editors. Can I swap another one real quick? This one's dead on arrival.
Wow. Well, thank you very much, Robert. This has been.
Thank you.
Yeah. So this has been great. I would love. So you introduced us to a lot of historical cartoonists that really kind of define where we are in present day. And for those that are watching or listening, we'll have we'll have links to some of these folks. We'll probably have some Wikipedia links to some of this historical stuff. It's great to know that as a visual storytelling, as a medium, that this wasn't created overnight. There's literally almost 200 years of history of cartoons, and we are, we're working on, as I said, cartoonists, we're working on the backs of giants. So, and we take a lot of this stuff for granted, as you said, like word balloons and, the political cartoon perspective of where the donkey and the elephant came from. And all these symbolism it came from someone. And it's good to step back and once in a while and reflect on that. And it's almost in a way of what we do. It's an honor to be a part of this medium,
mm-hmm.
And to know that we have this history behind us. And it's you kind of bring it back, Robert. It's almost an honor to do cartooning.
Yeah,
you're passing the torch on, and as you say, someone who's been a teacher, your skill is. You have, and this is the point, you have no idea how many lives you're able to touch, and you never will. It's just so many lives. And so I think it's important to think back and remind ourselves about that too.
Yep. Well, thank you for the opportunity. This was a lot of fun.
Yeah. And so if people want to reach out to you, they can go to your website, mrbrunelle.com.
Yep.
And there you have hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of things
Yeah,
you
I
can
have
look
links
at?
to everything. I have links to my artwork and my videos and my book illustrations and my comics. So all the different things I do, you'll find it right there. It's one-stop shopping.
Perfect. Well, thank you very much, Robert. This was a pleasure. And please let us know if you have a new book coming out or something you want to do. Just come back on by and we'll talk about it.
Very good.
All right. Well, thank you very much.
Okay.